why can one negative comment erase 10 positive ones?
Yeah, that is the ultimate question, isn't it?
I mean, it makes absolutely zero logical sense when you really stop and look at it. Just last week, I had this exact experience.
I think we all have. What happened?
Well, I received a highly complimentary email from a client, like glowing. And I had a wonderful dinner with friends who I know care about me.
Sounds like a pretty great day.
It was. But then right before bed, I got a 2-word reply from an editor on a project I'd, poured my heart into. The email just said, "Looks fine."
Oh, no. The dreaded lowercase f's.
Exactly. That was it.
Right.
Looks fine. And I'm not exaggerating when I tell you I spent the next 4 hours staring at the ceiling, completely convinced that fine was corporate code for, like, you are a fraud, your work is garbage, and you will never work in this industry again.
I mean, the spiral is so real. We've all been there.
It really is. My entire sense of self-worth collapsed over a single word. It's basically the ultimate glitch in the human operating system. So, welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
I'm so excited for this one.
Me too. Today, our mission is to decode this bizarre, intensely painful phenomenon. We are looking at the wildly disproportionate emotional reactions we all have to criticism, to rejection, and even to just, perceived slights.
And more importantly, we are going to figure out how to stop this biological and psychological hijacking from just completely ruining our lives.
Right. Because the goal today is not to just hand you a list of quick coping mechanisms. If we're going to rewire this response, we have to understand the foundational architecture of the problem.
We really do. And to get to the bottom of why your brain catastrophized that email, we are pulling from a massive, beautifully diverse stack of sources today.
It's a really good stack.
Yeah.
We are digging into clinical research on something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD.
Yeah, and we also have psychological frameworks exploring self-complexity theory and the internal family systems model. Plus, we're drawing from trauma recovery guides on emotional flashbacks.
Specifically the work of Pete Walker, which is just mind-blowing. And we also have insights from conflict management experts, and honestly, one of my favorite sources for this dive is a deeply philosophical Reddit thread.
That thread was amazing. It's just everyday people debating how to maintain self-esteem in the face of totally legitimate, accurate criticism.
Yeah, it's so practical. So we're going to figure out why your brain interprets a flat tone of voice in a Zoom meeting as a literal threat to your existence. And we're going to build an emotional boundary force field.
Basically, we're learning how to interpret criticism as data rather than, a death sentence.
Exactly. And to guide us through this labyrinth of neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and practical self-help, I am thrilled to have you here. You're essentially our translator for the human mind.
Well, thank you. I'm so ready to get into this. And, what really strikes me about your looks fine email story is how quickly you judged yourself for your reaction.
Oh, totally. I was so mad at myself for being awake at 2 a.m.
Right. We all do it. We lay awake at night and tell ourselves, I'm being too sensitive, or I just need to grow a thicker skin. We basically view our emotional pain as a character flaw.
Like there's something fundamentally broken inside us because we can't handle a simple piece of feedback.
Exactly. But when you start peeling back the layers of biology and neurology, the overarching theme is that your brain is actually performing flawlessly.
Wait, flawlessly. Staring at the ceiling for 4 hours is flawless execution.
It is executing its ancient programming perfectly. The problem is simply that, it is using an operating system designed for the Pleistocene epoch, and you are trying to use it in a modern corporate office.
So we are basically running Windows 95 hardware, trying to process a modern 5G emotional world.
That's exactly it.
Let's start right there, at that foundational level. Because before we can stop criticism from physically hurting, we have to understand the evolutionary mechanism of the pain itself.
Right. We have to look at why it evolved.
Because one of our sources from Neurodivergent Insights makes the argument that this hypersensitivity to rejection is not a glitch at all. It's a highly tuned survival mechanism.
Yeah, to understand the mechanism, you really have to transport yourself back like 100,000 years. Human beings are fundamentally pack animals.
We're not exactly the strongest predators out there.
No, not at all. We are not particularly fast, we don't have natural armor, and our claws are practically non-existent. Our only evolutionary advantage was our ability to cooperate in tightly knit social groups.
So belonging to the tribe meant you had access to a shared fire. It meant you got a portion of the mammoth meat.
Exactly. It meant you had people to watch your back while you slept. If you were excluded from the group, If you were rejected, it wasn't just a temporary blow to your ego, it was an absolute death sentence.
You would literally die of exposure or
Yeah.
starvation, or you'd just get eaten within days.
The stakes were existential, so the brain couldn't afford to be casual about social standing. Because of those life or death stakes, the human brain developed this hyper-vigilant radar system.
And its sole purpose was to detect the most microscopic signs of social exclusion.
Yes, the individuals who survived to pass on their genes were the ones who could perfectly read the room, who could adapt instantly to group norms, and who felt absolute terror at the thought of angering the tribal elders.
So we are basically the descendants of the most socially anxious hominids on the planet.
We really are. When you received that looks fine email, your ancient brain didn't see an editor being brief. It saw the tribal elder gesturing toward the edge of the cave.
Oh, wow. Telling me that I was about to be cast out into the freezing night.
Exactly. It was a survival response.
You know, that reframes the shame so much. I'm not weak. I'm just biologically motivated not to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger.
Right, your brain was just trying to keep you alive.
But our sources also highlight that for some people, this ancient radar system isn't just like humming in the background. It is cranked up to a volume that is actively destructive to their daily functioning.
Yes, and that brings us to rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD.
The clinical literature from ReachLink and Neurodivergent Insights points out that RSD affects up to 99% of adults with ADHD.
I know, the statistics are just staggering.
It's 99%.
Yeah.
That number blew my mind. It moves this completely out of the realm of just a personality quirk and squarely into, neurological reality.
It is a massive paradigm shift in how we understand ADHD. Historically, ADHD has been framed almost entirely around executive dysfunction.
Like forgetting your keys or not being able to focus on a spreadsheet.
Right, or interrupting people in meetings. But for the people actually living with it, the emotional dysregulation, specifically RSD, is often the most debilitating symptom.
How does it actually feel for them? Because I know it's intense.
It is characterized by an intense, overwhelming, almost unbearable emotional pain in response to perceived or actual rejection, teasing, criticism, or failure.
And the neuroscience behind what is happening in the ADHD brain during an RSD episode is incredibly complex, isn't it?
It really is. It essentially comes down to a trifecta of biological differences, starting with the amygdala.
Okay, the amygdala. That's the brain's threat detection center, right? Like the alarm system.
Yes. In many neurodivergent brains, the amygdala is simply hyperreactive. It is scanning the horizon for danger with the sensitivity of, like, a military-grade satellite.
But because we've established that the brain registers social rejection as a mortal danger, it's looking for social threats.
Exactly. The amygdala will flag incredibly mundane social cues as catastrophic threats. So a friend taking 3 hours to text back isn't processed as, oh, they are busy at work.
Right. The hyperreactive amygdala processes it as they have realized you are worthless and they are abandoning you forever.
Precisely. The alarm bells are deafening.
But wait, if there isn't actually a fire, shouldn't the prefrontal cortex step in? Like the logical reasoning part of the brain. Shouldn't it pump the brakes? Why aren't the brakes working here?
That is the second part of the trifecta. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for what we call top-down emotional regulation.
So in a neurotypical brain, what happens?
In a neurotypical brain, when a massive wave of panic bubbles up from the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex steps in, analyzes the data, and says, hold on, let's look at the evidence.
Like, this person is usually very brief in emails.
Yeah.
We are not getting fired. Stand down.
Exactly. But in an ADHD brain, there is demonstrably reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. The brake pads are, well, they're worn paper thin.
So when that wave of primal rejection terror hits, there is absolutely nothing to slow it down.
Nothing to contextualize it at all. It escalates from zero to overwhelming emotional flooding in milliseconds.
Wow. And the third piece of this puzzle has to do with dopamine, doesn't it? Which I guess makes sense given dopamine's starring role in ADHD.
Yes, dopamine is crucial here.
But I always thought dopamine was just like the reward chemical. How does it factor into feeling crushed by a passing comment?
It's a common misconception. Dopamine is often simplified as the reward chemical, but it is more accurately the neurotransmitter responsible for salience.
Salience, meaning like importance.
Exactly. It helps the brain weigh the emotional and practical significance of incoming information. It basically tells you what matters.
And in an ADHD brain, that system is flawed.
Right. Dopamine dysregulation means this sorting system is fundamentally out of whack. Think of it like a massive audio mixing board in a recording studio.
Okay, I like this analogy.
In a brain with RSD, the slider for positive feedback or compliments is stuck at like a 1. Someone can tell you that you are brilliant, and the brain barely registers the signal.
But the slider for criticism.
The slider for criticism or rejection is jammed all the way up to an 11. When a piece of negative feedback comes through, it just blows out the speakers.
So the brain physically cannot assign the correct proportion of importance to social cues.
No, it can't.
That mixing board analogy perfectly captures the opening question of this deep dive. Why does one negative comment erase 10 positive ones?
Because the positive comments are whispering at a level 1, and the negative comment is screaming through a megaphone at an 11.
It's so validating to hear. And here is a detail from the research that I think is going to validate so many people listening even more. Social rejection activates the exact same somatosensory neural pathways as physical pain.
It is a phenomenal biological reality.
But when people say, that critique felt like a punch to the gut, they are not using a metaphor.
They really aren't. When neuroscientists put people in fMRI machines and subject them to social exclusion, even something as simple as being left out of a virtual game of catch.
It's a virtual game of catch.
Yeah. The areas of the brain that light up are the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. These are the exact same regions that process the distress of physical injury.
So the brain does not have a separate hurt feelings department.
Nope. It uses the physical pain matrix. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this is actually brilliant.
Because if putting your hand on a hot stove causes searing physical pain,
Yeah.
you immediately pull your hand away, ensuring your survival.
Exactly. And if doing something that gets you rejected by the tribe causes searing emotional pain, you immediately change your behavior to get back in the group's good graces, ensuring your survival.
Wow, so someone with RSD, who describes chest tightness, nausea, or a heavy crushing physical pressure when they feel criticized, their brain is literally treating a bad performance review like a broken femur.
It is entirely real pain.
We also look at a really intriguing theoretical model from a Society preprint that proposed a new way to understand RSD. It framed it not just as an emotional overreaction, but as a form of inward-facing hyperfocus.
This was such a compelling theory.
Right? Because hyperfocus is usually seen as a superpower in ADHD. It's being so engrossed in writing a novel or coding a website that you forget to eat for 8 hours. How does that turn inward into something destructive?
The Society paper posits that RSD is what happens when that intense locking mechanism turns inward toward ambiguous or unresolved social cues.
Let's go back to my looks fine email.
Perfect example. An inward-facing hyperfocus traps your cognitive resources in a highly demanding closed-loop simulation. Your brain starts running thousands of microscopic scenarios.
Oh yeah, I was analyzing previous conversations with this editor, dissecting the tone of the word fine, projecting future scenarios where I lose my job.
It's like a computer program stuck in an infinite rendering loop. The fan is whirring, the battery is draining, and the processor is overheating.
That is exactly how I felt, sweating in bed.
And here is the devastating difference between external hyperfocus and inward hyperfocus. When you hyperfocus on coding a website, eventually you finish the website.
And you get a massive dopamine reward for completing the task.
Yes. But when you hyperfocus on trying to solve the ambiguous social cue of an email, there is no actionable input. You can never definitively prove what the other person was thinking.
So there is never a resolution.
Never. There's never a dopamine reward. The loop just spins indefinitely, provoking massive, sustained stress responses.
Before we move off the clinical definitions, I really want to clarify some boundaries here. Because intense fear of rejection sounds a lot like social anxiety disorder.
It does, on the surface.
And the extreme emotional volatility sounds a bit like borderline personality disorder. How do clinicians differentiate RSD from these other conditions, which I assume might require very different treatments?
Differential diagnosis is critical here because misdiagnosis is rampant. The key differentiator between RSD and social anxiety disorder is time.
Time, how so?
Social anxiety is anticipatory and chronic. If you have social anxiety, you might spend 2 weeks dreading an upcoming dinner party. You agonize over what you will wear, whether you will say something stupid, whether people will judge you. The fear exists long before the event.
Okay, so you're suffering in advance. But RSD is different.
RSD is acute, retroactive, and trigger-specific. A person with RSD might walk into that same dinner party feeling completely confident, charismatic, and at ease. The anticipation wasn't painful at all.
But If halfway through the night, someone makes a slightly sarcastic comment about their outfit.
The RSD storm hits instantly. It is a catastrophic, out-of-the-blue emotional crash.
And once the trigger is removed, or, the person clarifies that they were just joking and actually loved the outfit, the storm can pass relatively quickly.
Exactly, whereas social anxiety is a constant, low-level hum of dread.
What about borderline personality disorder, or BPD?
BPD involves a pervasive, deeply rooted fear of abandonment that shapes the individual's entire identity and drives profound relationship instability.
Like an extreme push-pull dynamic in relationships.
Yes, idealizing a partner one day and completely devaluing them the next. RSD does not typically feature that core identity disturbance or the systemic relationship instability.
So the person with RSD generally has a stable sense of self when they are not triggered.
Right. Their intense emotional reactions are specifically surgically tied to isolated instances of perceived criticism, failure, or rejection.
Okay, so cognitively, we really understand the hardware now. We have a hyperreactive smoke detector, the amygdala, that physically cannot tell the difference between a piece of slightly burnt toast, which is a minor critique of our work.
And the entire house burning down, which is total social exile.
Exactly. The alarm sounds exactly the same. It triggers physical pain, and the prefrontal cortex brakes are shot. But here's my fundamental question.
Go for it.
If our biology and our neurology are hardwired this way, are we just doomed? Like, are we just trapped in this cycle of disproportionate pain forever?
That is the pivotal transition of this entire discussion. Biology is the foundation, yes, but it is not destiny.
Oh, thank goodness.
The biological alarm system doesn't just ring a loud, wordless bell. It usually translates that primal fear into an internal narrative. It starts speaking to us.
Okay.
And to change our reaction to criticism, we have to look very closely at who is doing the talking inside our own heads when the alarm goes off.
Which brings us to the psychological framework of the inner critic. Because once that physical wave of RSD hits, there's a voice that takes over, and it is usually utterly brutal.
It really is.
It is the voice that told me I was a fraud after reading that email.
We looked at the internal family systems model, often abbreviated as IFS, through the work of Natasha Wilson.
And IFS is a completely radical, deeply compassionate take on the inner critic.
It's a beautiful framework because in traditional pop psychology, we are constantly told to just silence our inner critic. We are taught to view it as a parasite, an enemy, like a demon that we need to vanquish or go to war with.
But IFS views the human mind not as a single unified monolith, but as a complex system of different parts, almost like a family living inside your head.
And from the IFS perspective, the inner critic is actually a protector part of your psyche.
It is not trying to destroy you. It is desperately, frantically trying to keep you safe. I really struggled with this concept at first, I won't lie. The voice that tells me I am fundamentally unlovable, that I am stupid, that I should just quit my career before I embarrass myself.
Yeah.
That voice is trying to protect me.
Right.
How on earth does that logic track?
It sounds counterintuitive, but Wilson breaks down the origin of this voice into the 3 acts of the shame cycle. Walking through this really connects the dots.
Let's explore how a child actually builds this protector, because this was eye-opening.
It requires us to look at childhood trauma, and I use trauma here with a lowercase t.
Right.
It doesn't have to be massive abuse. It can be repeated emotional neglect or just harsh parenting.
Right. So Act 1 is the inciting incident.
Yes, an authority figure, a parent, a teacher, a coach, shames the child. Let's use a tangible example. A 7-year-old child accidentally spills a gallon of milk all over the kitchen floor.
Okay.
The parent, who is incredibly stressed about finances and work, loses their temper completely. They yell, "What is wrong with you? Why are you so clumsy? You ruin everything."
And the child is entirely passive in this moment. The shame is coming at them from the outside.
Exactly. And a 7-year-old simply does not have the cognitive capacity or the life experience to pause and say, wow, my dad is clearly projecting his workplace anxiety onto me.
Right. They can't say, he severely lacks emotional regulation skills, but this milk spill is actually a minor accident and does not reflect my inherent worth. A child cannot do that.
They cannot contextualize it at all, which leads directly to Act 2, acceptance.
This is the tragic part.
It is. A child is entirely dependent on their caregivers for survival. They cannot afford to believe that the gods of their universe, their parents, are flawed, irrational, or unsafe.
Because if the parents are unsafe, the child's entire world collapses into terrifying chaos.
Exactly. So the child's psyche performs an incredibly tragic yet brilliant adaptive maneuver to make the world make sense. The child internalizes the blame. They accept the burden of the shame as their core identity.
They subconsciously deduce. The world is safe, my parents are good and perfect, therefore I must be fundamentally bad. I am clumsy, I ruin things. I am a mistake.
By taking on the badness, the child maintains the vital illusion that they live in a safe, predictable environment.
It is heartbreaking when you frame it that way. The child literally sacrifices their own self-worth to protect the image of the parent.
They do. And that brings us to Act 3, which is where the inner critic is officially born and takes the wheel.
Act 3, the proactive manager.
Yes, once the core belief of I am fundamentally bad is established, a new part of the psyche recognizes a massive vulnerability. If the child is bad, they're at constant risk of being rejected, yelled at, or abandoned by the tribe.
So this new manager part steps up and says, okay, since you are deeply flawed, I'm going to have to police your every single behavior to make sure nobody else finds out how bad you are.
I will criticize you before anyone else gets the chance. I will make you hide your anger. I will suppress your joy. I will force you to be invisible so that you blend in and stay safe.
Wow. This manager is your inner critic. It uses instrumental shaming. It hurts you internally to prevent you from being annihilated externally.
That shifts the entire paradigm. The inner critic isn't a demon. It's an overzealous, exhausted bodyguard who is still operating under the assumption that you are a helpless 7-year-old facing an existential threat from an angry parent.
It's using data from 3 decades ago.
Mm.
And Wilson's work breaks down how these critics actually develop different styles based on the Enneagram personality typing system.
I found this fascinating because it takes this abstract concept and makes it hyper-specific.
Oh, listeners will absolutely recognize their own personal bodyguard in this list. Let's look at a few, starting with the underminer.
The underminer is a very common protector style. Its primary objective is to erode your self-confidence to protect you from the risk of failure or public humiliation.
Give me an example of the underminer in action.
Let's say you want to apply for a major promotion. The underminer immediately steps in and whispers, "Don't even bother replying. You aren't qualified." They will laugh at your resume. It's completely pointless.
And the logic is flawless, in a twisted way. If you never try, you can never fail. And if you never fail, you never have to experience the agonizing pain of rejection. It keeps you small, but it keeps you safe.
Exactly. You know the underminer well.
I know the underminer intimately.
Right.
And then there's the molder. The molder doesn't necessarily want you to do nothing. It just wants you to conform perfectly.
It wants you to fit the cultural, societal, or family norms at all costs. It says, keep your head down. Don't speak up in that meeting. People will think you're aggressive. Dress like everyone else. Don't make a fool of yourself.
The Nolner attacks any divergence from the norm, any spark of unique individuality, because standing out means you are a target. It wants you safely camouflaged.
Then you have the guilt tripper. This critic is obsessed with the past. It constantly replays your previous mistakes, failures, or moments where you hurt someone.
It says, remember that time you misspoke 5 years ago? You are a terrible person. You can never forgive yourself for that.
Its goal is behavioral control through chronic guilt. It believes that by constantly punishing you for a past rupture in a relationship, it guarantees you will never be careless enough to repeat that behavior and risk abandonment again.
And finally, the perfectionist, the most culturally rewarded inner critic, I'd say.
Oh, absolutely. The perfectionist demands flawless performance and holds you to impossibly high shifting standards. This report is garbage. You need to work until 2 a.m. to fix it. Try harder.
The core belief of the perfectionist is that if you can somehow achieve absolute, unassailable perfection in your work, your appearance, and your behavior, you will finally be beyond criticism. You will be bulletproof.
But the tragedy of the perfectionist is that perfection does not exist. So the critic is constantly moving the goalposts, ensuring you are permanently exhausted and chronically dissatisfied with yourself.
It is wild how these voices masquerade as the absolute objective truth about who we are, when in reality, they're just frightened defense mechanisms trying to manage ancient anxiety.
They really are. And this ties directly into the work of Pete Walker on trauma and emotional flashbacks.
Because when someone gives us criticism today, and the inner critic jumps into action, we aren't just reacting to the present moment. We're actually flashing back.
Yes, but Pete Walker's definition of a flashback is very different from what we see in Hollywood movies, isn't it?
Very different. The Hollywood depiction of a flashback is highly visual and auditory. You know, a combat veteran hearing a car backfire and suddenly hallucinating that they're back in a war zone diving for cover.
Right. But Pete Walker's pioneering work on complex PTSD identifies the phenomenon of emotional flashbacks. These are sudden, often prolonged, intensely vivid regressions to the feeling of childhood danger, abandonment, and helplessness.
Crucially, there's usually no visual or memory component. You do not see a mental movie of your parent yelling at you.
No, you just suddenly, inexplicably feel an overwhelming, suffocating sense of fear, toxic shame, or despair in the present moment.
Which explains exactly why we rarely realize we are even having a flashback. We just think, my boss sent me an email with a typo correction, and now I feel like I am a worthless human being.
We genuinely believe the magnitude of our despair is about the typo. We think the feeling belongs to the present.
But it's actually an emotional time machine. We have been hijacked back to 1998.
That is the perfect way to describe it. You are stranded in the terrifying emotional landscape of your original childhood shaming.
And because this feeling is so completely overwhelming, and because the prefrontal cortex is offline, the brain desperately deploys behavioral defense mechanisms to try and survive the perceived threat.
And Walker categorizes these survival strategies into the 4 Fs.
Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. We hear these terms all the time, but usually in the context of like outrunning a predator in the woods. Let's detail how these primal responses actually manifest in adulthood when someone is triggered by criticism in a modern workplace or relationship.
Seeing these as trauma responses rather than personality traits is incredibly validating. Let's start with the fight response.
Okay, what does fight look like in an office?
When triggered into an emotional flashback by criticism, someone utilizing the fight response goes on the offensive to ward off the internal feeling of defectiveness. They unconsciously believe that the best defense is a good offense.
So, extreme defensiveness.
Exactly. In a workplace, they might become entitled, arrogant, or misuse their power. If a manager critiques their project, they attack the manager's competence, blame their coworkers, or throw a tantrum.
They use anger and intimidation to push the perceived threat away so they don't have to feel the underlying shame.
The classic, you can't fire me, I quit energy. You burn the building down so nobody can tell you the roof was leaking.
What about the flight response? Because I assume this doesn't mean literally sprinting out of the office building.
No, in the context of emotional flashbacks, flight rarely means physical running. It usually manifests as fleeing obsessively into activities. It is an attempt to outrun the internal pain through sheer momentum.
This is the root of chronic workaholism, isn't it?
It is. It's extreme perfectionism. It can look like micromanaging every detail of a project or staying at the office until midnight every single night.
It can also manifest as addiction, right? Using uppers or engaging in risky behaviors to create a constant state of adrenaline.
Exactly. Because if you never stop moving, if you are always busy, you never have to sit quietly in a room with your own feelings of inadequacy.
And then we have the freeze response. The deer in the headlights, what does that look like?
The freeze response is characterized by numbing, dissociation, and collapsing. When the emotional pain of the flashback is too much to bear, the nervous system essentially pulls the plug to conserve energy.
So this looks like deep isolation, sleeping 14 hours a day.
Yes. Or over-fantasizing, tuning out by scrolling on a phone or playing video games for 10 hours straight without moving.
Yeah.
It can involve the use of downer substances to numb the mind.
The person detaches entirely from reality because reality feels too dangerous and overwhelming to navigate.
And the final response, which is fawn. I think out of all of these, fawning is the one that so many people who struggle with severe rejection sensitivity will immediately recognize.
It is the ultimate appeasement strategy.
Fawning is the chronic people-pleasing response. When faced with criticism or conflict, the fawn response immediately abandons the self to merge with the desires of the attacker. It is obsequious, codependent relating.
If someone criticizes you, you immediately agree with them. You preemptively apologize for things you didn't do.
You bend over backwards to fix the situation, completely ignoring your own boundaries, needs, and reality, just to de-escalate the threat and regain the other person's approval.
You basically become whatever they need you to be, hoping that if you are useful enough, they won't abandon you.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because the picture we've painted so far is intense.
It is very heavy.
We have a hyper-reactive biological alarm system. When it goes off, it wakes up an overzealous inner bodyguard who thinks we are 7 years old. This bodyguard then throws us into a full-blown emotional time machine where we unconsciously either fight our coworkers, work ourselves to the point of a heart attack, dissociate on the couch for a weekend, or become a spineless doormat for whoever is upset with us.
That is a very accurate summary.
If this is the mechanism, How do we respectfully fire this bodyguard? Or at the very least, how do we retrain and reassign them? Because right now, the protector is actively destroying the very life, career, and relationships it is trying to keep safe.
To reassign the bodyguard, we have to look closely at what the bodyguard is actually guarding. What is the precious cargo?
And what is it?
The inner critic is guarding your core identity and your self-worth. Which brings us to a fascinating, highly structural psychological concept: how human identity is constructed in the first place.
Why does a critique of our work, like a spreadsheet, an email, a presentation, feel like a devastating critique of our soul?
This is exactly where the deep dive moves from the problem into the architecture of the solution. We looked at the work of Greg Hessel, a conflict management expert.
Yes, and he points out a fundamental flaw in human cognition. Humans are meaning-making machines.
We are constantly observing neutral data and instantly spinning it into a narrative, and then we confuse our invented narrative with absolute objective truth.
When we engage in conflict or when we receive a piece of criticism, there's the surface-level conversation, and then there's the subterranean identity conversation.
Right. On the surface, you and your boss might be arguing about the formatting of a quarterly report. But the identity questions flashing like neon signs in your amygdala are, what does this mean about me? Am I competent? Am I a failure? Am I valued here? Am I loved?
Hessel points out that to manage these intense, disproportionate reactions, we need to actively work to complexify our identity.
Complexify our identity. I love that phrasing so much.
It makes so much sense. If we have a rigid, black and white, singular identity. For example, if my entire internal narrative is, I am the absolute best, most flawless consultant in this firm, and then a client gives me a slightly negative review, I am going to get incredibly defensive and aggressive.
You have to, because that single piece of feedback literally threatens the only definition of yourself that you possess.
But if my identity is more nuanced and complexified, like I am a highly competent consultant who works hard, is constantly learning, and occasionally misses the mark because I am human, then the negative feedback doesn't destroy me. It just updates the learning part of my identity.
This intuitive concept is actually backed by a very robust psychological framework known as self-complexity theory, which was originally developed by psychologist Patricia Linville.
She proposed that a person's global self-concept is not a single monolith, right?
Exactly. It is made up of numerous distinct cognitive structures, which she termed self-aspects. These self-aspects encompass your social roles, your relationships, your hobbies, and your traits.
So, for instance, you might have a self-aspect as a corporate lawyer, another as a devoted mother, another as an amateur cellist, another as a loyal friend, and another as a marathon runner.
And the core argument of her theory is that the number of these distinct self-aspects and how rigorously separated they are from one another determines your overall self-complexity.
Let's play this out. What happens when a person has high self-complexity?
Someone with high self-complexity possesses many distinct, well-developed self-aspects. Linville's research showed that this acts as a profound structural cognitive buffer against stress, failure, and criticism.
So imagine you are highly self-complex. You have a terrible, brutal day at the law firm. You lose a case, and a senior partner heavily criticizes your legal competence.
Your self-aspect as a lawyer takes a massive hit. It is damaged. However, because you have high self-complexity, your self-aspects as a mother, a cellist, and a friend remain entirely intact and unaffected.
When you leave the office, you can consciously retreat into those other thriving identities to preserve your baseline global self-worth. You are able to compartmentalize the psychological damage.
The analogy that immediately comes to mind here is a financial portfolio. High self-complexity is exactly like having a highly diversified investment portfolio.
Yes, if you put your entire life savings into a single tech stock, and that one company has a bad quarter and the stock crashes, you are entirely ruined. You are bankrupt.
But if you have a beautifully diversified portfolio, you have some tech stocks, but you also have real estate, healthcare bonds, and international index funds. A bad day in the tech sector is annoying, but it doesn't wipe out your life savings. Your other investments are doing just fine.
A bad day at work doesn't bankrupt your existential self-worth.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it perfectly illustrates the danger of what Linville called the spillover effect, which happens when your portfolio is not diversified or when your investments are too deeply entangled.
Let's look at someone with low self-complexity. Imagine their entire identity, 90% of their self-worth, is tied up in the single role of being a lawyer.
Furthermore, their spouse is also a lawyer at the same firm, and all their social friends are lawyers. In this scenario, the self-aspects are overlapping and enmeshed.
If their legal work is criticized, That negative affect cannot be compartmentalized. It spills over.
It contaminates their identity as a spouse, it poisons their identity as a friend, it unravels their entire global self-concept. The cognitive structure is woven so tightly that pulling one single thread unravels the entire sweater.
So the prescription seems obvious. Go out, get a bunch of hobbies, join a bowling league, diversify your identity portfolio so you have cognitive buffers.
But in the spirit of looking at all sides of the research, our sources, specifically the Wikipedia deep dive on self-complexity, did present a valid counterargument. There are some modern researchers who argue there are actually benefits to low self-complexity and dangers to high complexity, right?
Yes, it is crucial to represent the nuance in the literature. While Linville focused on the buffering effects against negative events, subsequent psychologists have pointed out that low self-complexity can actually massively amplify positive events.
Like if your entire universe, your singular identity is tied up in being a musician and you win a Grammy, that positive effect floods your entire being with an intensity that someone with a diversified identity might not feel because there are no boundaries stopping the joy from spilling over.
Furthermore, researchers warn that artificially inflating your self-complexity, just collecting random roles and hobbies for the sake of it, can lead to role conflict, fragmentation, and chronic stress.
Trying to simultaneously embody the cutthroat CEO, the endlessly nurturing parent, the wild bohemian artist, and the disciplined triathlete requires an exhausting amount of context switching.
The emerging consensus in psychology is that it is not just the sheer mathematical volume of identities that creates resilience. It is the authenticity and integration of those self-aspects. Being truly self-determined and grounded in your roles matters far more than just having a crowded calendar.
That makes perfect sense. It's not a quantity, it's about authentic quality. And speaking of authenticity, this brings us to one of the most unexpected but profound sources in our stack today.
We pulled a massive thread from a Reddit community dedicated to self-improvement. The original poster asked a very simple, incredibly agonizing question. How do you maintain your self-esteem while being legitimately criticized?
Because up until now, we've mostly been talking about perceived rejection or unfair criticism or the amygdala overreacting to ambiguous texts.
But what if the critique is accurate? What if you did mess up the presentation? What if you're a bad listener? How do you survive that without spiraling?
The crowdsourced wisdom that emerged from that Reddit thread was phenomenal and remarkably aligned with high-level clinical psychology. One user, named MaxGav, highlighted the absolutely crucial boundary between criticizing behavior, which is what you were doing, versus criticizing personality, which is who you are being.
They noted that legitimate, constructive criticism always addresses the action. For example, you repeated yourself a lot in that presentation and the slides were cluttered. That is hard to hear, but it is actionable.
Criticism becomes destructive and triggers our shame spirals when it crosses the line and attacks the being. You are a terrible communicator and a sloppy worker.
Yes, labeling the actions, not the person. And another user in that same thread, Scatman Joe, dropped a philosophical truth bomb that completely stopped me in my tracks and shifted my entire perspective on this topic.
What did they say?
They addressed the root cause of why criticism hurt so much. They said that if you base your self-esteem on conditional variables, your achievements, your physical looks, your productivity, your salary, or even your positive personality traits, you are always constantly vulnerable because all of those things can be lost, critiqued, or taken away.
Instead, they proposed this radical concept. Think of self-worth as a fixed unit. Every single human being on Earth is born with exactly one unit of self-worth.
It is a profound, almost spiritual reframing of human value. You have exactly one unit. You cannot increase your unit by winning a Pulitzer Prize or making $1 million or having everyone at the party like you.
And, crucially, you cannot decrease your unit by making a mistake, getting fired, or being harshly criticized. It is entirely static. It is your inherent humanity.
With that framework in mind, when someone criticizes you, your core unit of worth is never actually on the table. It is perfectly safe in a vault. All you have to decide is whether their feedback about your external behavior is useful data for your future growth.
If we connect this Reddit wisdom back to the inner critic and the biological alarm system we discussed earlier, this is exactly the key to turning off the alarm.
Why does the amygdala fire during criticism? Because it mistakenly believes your survival, your core worth, is being threatened.
If you can deeply cognitively internalize the belief that your worth is a fixed unit, untouchable and undiminishable by any external opinion, the biological threat response begins to lose its power over you. The stakes are lowered. You aren't fighting for your life anymore. You are just evaluating feedback.
Okay, I have to push back on this, though. I love the one unit of self-worth concept intellectually. It is incredibly comforting, but is it actually true in practice?
What do you mean?
Because society absolutely does not treat people as if they have equal units of worth. Society undeniably treats a successful, wealthy CEO as having vastly more worth than someone who is unemployed and struggling. If the external reality of the world operates on conditional worth, how do we successfully maintain this internal belief without just feeling dangerously delusional?
That is the essential friction, isn't it? You are entirely correct that the external world, capitalism, social hierarchies, the market, assigns wildly varying conditional value to human beings based on their output and status.
The critical distinction you have to make is divorcing your market value from your existential value.
Your market value will fluctuate. Your skills might become obsolete. Your company might fail. Your social status might dip. That is the reality of the external world.
But the fixed unit refers to your existential value, your inherent right to exist, to seek joy, to be treated with basic dignity.
The goal is not to delude yourself into thinking society won't judge your output. The goal is to refuse to let society's judgment of your output dictate your internal existential baseline.
When the CEO and the unemployed person are alone in a room experiencing grief or joy or fear, their humanity is identical. The work of resilience is reminding yourself that the market only gets to critique your resume. It does not get to appraise your soul.
Divorcing market value from existential value, that is incredibly powerful. But knowing that intellectually, while sitting in a quiet room and actually feeling it in the heat of the moment when someone is actively yelling at you, are two very different things.
Which brings us to the application phase. We have the theory. We know our worth is a fixed unit. We know our identity should be diversified like a good portfolio. But how do we actively, physically protect all of that in real time when someone is projecting all of their negativity, stress, and anger directly onto us?
This is where we turn to the brilliant work of Haley McGee. She is a certified coach who specializes in helping recovering people pleasers establish emotional boundaries.
McGee introduces this powerful, deeply resonant visual tool, the emotional boundary bubble. She asks you to visualize a translucent bubble or a glowing golden force field completely surrounding your body.
Its entire architectural purpose is a two-way filter. It keeps your authentic emotions safely in, and it keeps other people's chaotic emotions firmly out.
It sounds like a simple visualization, but for anyone who identifies as a people pleaser or who operates with that fawn trauma response we talked about earlier, building this bubble feels incredibly alien and difficult.
McGee describes what she calls the people pleaser's dilemma, and her metaphor here is perfect. She says that without an emotional boundary bubble, other people's emotions bleed into us like dark ink dropped into a pool of clear water.
The ink and water metaphor is terrifyingly accurate for people with high empathy but low boundaries. If you lack that force field, you become a highly reactive sponge.
If your partner wakes up anxious about their day, suddenly you are vibrating with anxiety, even though you have nothing to be anxious about. If your boss is furious about a lost client, you absorb their rage, your heart rate spikes, and you frantically scramble to appease them, even if the lost client had nothing to do with you.
You navigate your entire life like a tiny, rudderless boat in stormy waters, completely at the whim of the unpredictable sea of other people's moods. You lose total access to your own emotional reality because you are too busy processing everyone else's.
So how do we stop the ink from spreading? How do we build the bubble? McGee outlines a highly practical three-step process for inner peace. Step one is simply to notice your reactivity.
Yes, and this links perfectly back to our discussion on the biology of RSD and the somatosensory pathways. Step one happens in the body, not the brain. You have to start noticing your physical reactivity before your brain even registers the narrative of the emotion.
When a coworker sighs heavily next to you, do you feel a sudden, sharp tightness in your chest? When a friend disagrees with your opinion, does your stomach suddenly drop or feel hot? You have to map your body's alarm system. You have to recognize the exact physical sensation of the ink hitting the water.
And once you notice that physical spike, you immediately move to step two, which I honestly think is the biggest aha moment of this entire deep dive. You pause, and you ask yourself three simple words. Is this mine?
Is this mine? It is the ultimate clarifying inquiry. When you feel that sudden spike of panic because someone around you is upset, you take a breath and ask the question, am I feeling an emotion that is grounded in my own life experience right now, or has someone else's emotional ink just infiltrated my water?
And if the answer is no, I was actually having a great day until they walked in, this anxiety is not mine, That is the exact moment you deploy the visualization. You visualize the golden force field. You picture their anger or their disappointment or their anxiety hitting the outside of your bubble and simply sliding off the glass. It
Yeah.
is not yours to process. It is not yours to carry.
Let's ground this in the real-world scenarios McGee provides, because it shows exactly how step 3, act non-reactively, plays out in practice. Imagine an angry husband comes home from work. He slams the door, cracks a beer, and starts furiously venting about his terrible boss and how unfair his company is.
In the past, the wife without boundaries, the ink and water wife, would feel her own heart rate spike the second the door slammed. She would absorb his rage. She would get furious on his behalf. Her evening would be ruined, and she would immediately launch into a flurry of unsolicited, frantic solutions. You need to talk to HR tomorrow. You need to quit. Let me help you rewrite your resume right now.
She becomes completely physiologically dysregulated by his problem, desperately trying to fix it so he will calm down and she can feel safe again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is exhausting. But let's look at how the sequence changes with the boundary bubble. The husband comes home and vents. The wife notices her heart rate spike. That's step 1. She pauses and asks, "Is this mine?" That's step 2. She realizes, "No, I had a lovely day. This conflict is entirely between my husband and his boss. This rage belongs to him." She visualizes the force field. The ink stops spreading.
And then, step 3, she acts non-reactively. Now, acting non-reactively does not mean ignoring him. From inside her safe, calm bubble, she can be deeply compassionate. She can look at him and say, "Gosh, that sounds incredibly frustrating and unfair. I am so sorry you had to deal with that today."
She empathizes from a place of grounded stability. She validates his experience, but she doesn't try to fix it. She doesn't take ownership of his career crisis.
Yeah.
And after listening for a reasonable amount of time, she is able to transition the conversation and continue with her evening untainted by his bad day.
Another brilliant, highly relatable example from the text is a lawyer who is moving out of state. She got an incredible new job opportunity, but it means moving away from her tight-knit hometown. Her parents are deeply disappointed, and they constantly throw passive-aggressive guilt trips at her. "Who is going to help your father with the yard? Are you sure you want to abandon your family for a job?"
That is textbook guilt tripping. And historically, the lawyer, lacking boundaries, might have absorbed that heavy despair. She might have started doubting her own excellent decision. She might have engaged in hours of exhausting, tearful arguments, desperately trying to justify her choices to make her parents feel better, ultimately sacrificing her own joy to manage their grief.
But utilizing the boundary protocol changes the game. When the parents make a passive-aggressive comment over dinner, she notices the familiar tightness in her chest. She pauses. Is this mine? She reminds herself that her parents' loneliness, their fear of an empty nest, and their disappointment is entirely theirs to manage. It is a natural reaction, but it is not her responsibility to fix.
From safely inside her bubble, she checks in with her own authentic emotion. She's immensely proud of herself and excited about this career move. So, step 3, she acts non-reactively. She calmly states, "I know you are going to miss me and I will miss you too, but I am really excited for this next step in my career." She refuses to pick up her end of the emotional tug-of-war rope.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I can hear people listening and thinking the same thing I thought. Does this protocol just turn us into cold, unfeeling sociopaths? Someone I love is genuinely hurting, and I just put up a shiny force field and say, "Not my problem, that's your ink." Isn't that a profound lack of empathy? Are we just isolating ourselves in these little psychological bunkers?
It is a vital, necessary question, and McGee clarifies this nuance beautifully in her work. Establishing emotional boundaries is absolutely not about cultivating cold, callous detachment. We are human beings. We are meant to connect. It is entirely natural and healthy to feel sadness when a loved one is experiencing grief.
The pathology arises when their emotion completely dominates your nervous system and erases your ability to know what you feel. The boundary bubble is not a thick brick wall. Think of it more like a biological, semi-permeable membrane. The ultimate goal is a healthy, sustainable middle ground. It is the ability to respond lovingly with deep compassion, active listening, and genuine empathy without letting their emotional state dictate your internal reality or your subsequent behaviors.
As the saying goes in therapeutic circles, you can hold their hand while they cry, but you do not have to drown in the puddle with them.
You can hold their hand, but you don't have to drown in the puddle. That is a stunning way to put it. It's empathy without enmeshment.
But, and this brings us to the final, most pragmatic part of our deep dive. What happens when the floodgates open anyway? Because we are only human. We can read all the books, we can understand self-complexity, we can visualize the bubble every morning, but sometimes a piece of criticism is delivered with such venom or hits us so perfectly in our most vulnerable, unhealed childhood wound that the bubble just pops.
We are instantly triggered into a blinding RSD episode or a full-body emotional flashback. The prefrontal cortex is gone. What do we do in the literal eye of the storm? We need an emergency toolkit.
You are exactly right. When the amygdala hijack reaches its peak, logic is useless. You cannot think your way out of a flashback or a severe RSD episode in the first 5 minutes. Telling yourself I have a diversified identity portfolio while you feel like you are dying of shame is like throwing a cup of water on a house fire.
You have to use physiological interventions to send a biological signal to your brainstem that you are safe. We looked at grounding techniques from Counseling and Psychological Services, or CAPS. These are entirely sensory awareness exercises.
Their purpose is not to analyze the feeling. Their purpose is to aggressively, sometimes violently, yank your consciousness away from the internal simulation loop and anchor it back into the physical present moment.
We have to shock the system back online. What are the specific, actionable techniques?
The most famous and highly effective is the 5-4-3-2-1 countdown. When you feel the panic cresting, you force your brain to verbally identify 5 things you can clearly see in the room. Then, 4 things you can physically feel, like the texture of your shirt or the chair beneath you. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. And 1 thing you can taste.
By demanding that the brain process varied, real-time sensory data, you forcefully divert electrical energy away from the amygdala's panic loop and back into the sensory processing centers.
Other tactile techniques include keeping a small, highly textured stone in your pocket. When triggered, you put your hand in your pocket and focus 100% of your attention on the weight, temperature, and ridges of the stone. Or taking slow sips of freezing cold water, meticulously tracking the sensation of the cold liquid traveling down your throat.
The temperature shock of cold water actually activates the mammalian dive reflex in the parasympathetic nervous system, which biologically forces your heart rate to slow down.
One visual that really stood out to me from the CAPS source was a specific breathing exercise. It's not just take deep breaths. It involves taking a deep breath in, and as you forcefully exhale, you visualize pushing the air down through your body and breathing it out through the soles of your feet, feeling your feet planted firmly on the floor. It creates a literal physical sensation of being grounded to the earth.
And then, once the heart rate dips just slightly, you can introduce cognitive grounding.
Exactly. Once the physiological panic subsides by even 10%, you use cognitive grounding to force the prefrontal cortex to reboot and take the wheel back. You ask yourself incredibly basic, mundane orientation questions. Where am I sitting? What is the day today? What is the current year? How old am I?
Answering these factual questions breaks the hypnotic illusion of the emotional flashback. It firmly reminds your nervous system that you are not 7 years old, helpless, and trapped in your childhood bedroom with an angry parent. You are an adult, it is the present year, you have agency, and you are in a safe environment.
Which perfectly lines up with the pause protocol for managing RSD provided by ReachLink. This is a brilliant 5-step framework designed to navigate the absolute peak of an episode without destroying your career or relationships in the process. Let's walk through pause using a real scenario. Say I just received a harsh, highly critical Slack message from a colleague that makes me feel completely incompetent.
Okay, let's run the protocol. The Slack message comes in, your chest tightens. Step 1 is P. Pause your physical response. This is the most critical step. Stop whatever your hands are doing. Take your hands off the keyboard. Do not send that defensive, passive-aggressive reply. Do not immediately email your boss to quit. Literally, physically distance yourself from the device.
Step 2 is A. Acknowledge the feeling without judgment. You talk to yourself objectively. My chest is tight. My nervous system is flooded. I am having an RSD episode. You do not add secondary shame by telling yourself, I'm so stupid for getting upset over a Slack message. You just acknowledge the weather system passing through your body.
Step 3 is you. Understand the trigger. You pinpoint the exact locus of the pain. I am triggered because they use the word sloppy to describe my data entry, and that triggers my fear of being seen as incompetent.
Step 4 is S. Separate perception from reality. This is where the prefrontal cortex works. You consciously acknowledge the massive gap between your brain's catastrophic interpretation and the factual evidence. My brain is telling me I am going to be fired today. The reality is, they just asked me to double-check column B. I might just need to fix a typo. The catastrophe is a perception, not a fact.
And finally, step 5 is E, engage support. Text a safe friend who understands your sensitivity. Use one of the physical grounding skills we just discussed. Or simply engage your own self-compassion, reminding yourself that this emotional tsunami is temporary and will eventually recede. It's a lifesaver of an acronym. And Pete Walker's 13-point list for managing emotional flashbacks has a very similar comforting rhythm. He emphasizes the importance of explicitly, verbally telling yourself, I am having a flashback. He says you must mentally approach your inner child, that part of you holding the shame, and remind them that they are safe now, that they are currently inhabiting a capable adult body with allies, financial resources, and escape routes that they absolutely did not have in the past. If you suddenly feel very small and little during a conflict, that is the ultimate red flag of a flashback.
Walker also points out the absolute necessity of deconstructing what he calls eternity thinking. In childhood, when we are hurt, shamed, or abandoned, the pain feels like it will last forever because children lack a developed concept of long-term time. During an adult flashback, that same phenomenon occurs. The pain and shame feel endless, permanent, and fatal. You have to cognitively, repeatedly remind yourself that this feeling is just a neurochemical wave washing over your brain receptors. And like all waves, no matter how massive or violent, it will eventually break and pass. He also advises that we have to actively, aggressively resist the inner critic during these vulnerable moments. We can't just let it monologue. We have to use thought stopping to yell stop to the catastrophic planning, and then use thought substitution to actively force our brains to list our accomplishments, our good qualities, and the positive feedback we've received in the past.
Exactly. In that moment, you are essentially marching up to the stage, taking the microphone away from the panicked inner critic, and firmly handing it to your compassionate, logical adult self.
So, stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, what does this all mean for our daily lives? It sounds like, ultimately, no one is coming to save us from our own reactions. We have to become our own internal first responders. We are the paramedics arriving at the scene of our own emotional car crashes.
But here's the catch. Trying to remember an acronym like PAUSE or trying to visualize a golden force field when you feel like you've just been violently punched in the gut is a massively tall order. How do we actually utilize these tools when our brains are offline?
You practice them when there is no crisis. You do not wait for the building to be engulfed in flames to figure out where the fire exits are. You practice fire drills on a calm, sunny Tuesday.
You have to build the neural pathways of self-regulation when the stakes are incredibly low. You practice the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique while you are sitting in perfectly relaxed traffic. You visualize your golden boundary bubble while you are brushing your teeth in the morning. You practice whispering, I have one fixed unit of self-worth while you are making your coffee. You wire the concepts into your brain through sheer repetition so that they become deeply ingrained muscle memory. When the crisis finally hits and the prefrontal cortex goes dark, your body will automatically know what to do because it has rehearsed it 1,000 times.
Muscle memory for the mind. I love that. Okay, let's bring this incredible journey all together. We have covered massive ground today. We started by exploring the deep, ancient evolutionary roots of why criticism physically hurts, understanding that our need to belong to the tribe was a matter of life and death, and how that legacy lives on in the dopamine and amygdala dysregulation of rejection-sensitive dysphoria. We uncovered how our internal bodyguard, the inner critic, formed in childhood to protect us from shame, but now mistakenly hijacks us into terrifying emotional flashbacks based on outdated data.
We learned that to protect our core selves, we need to actively diversify our identity portfolio through self-complexity, ensuring that a bad day at the office doesn't bankruptcy our existential self-worth. We internalized the profound truth that our value as human beings is a fixed unit, untouchable by external critique. And finally, we learned how to build a semi-permeable emotional boundary bubble, arming ourselves with sensory grounding tools, the mammalian dive reflex, and the PAUSE protocol to navigate the storm when the alarms inevitably trigger.
And if we ask the ultimate question, the so what of all this, why doing this incredibly hard internal work matters so deeply, it is fundamentally about reclaiming your life. For so long, people who experience extreme, agonizing sensitivity to criticism live their entire lives playing defense. They shrink their personalities, they avoid taking creative or professional risks, they people-please and fawn, they silence their own needs, all to construct a life that avoids the devastating pain of potential rejection.
But By understanding your biology, by separating your behavior from your immutable unit of self-worth, and by recognizing criticism as simply external data rather than an existential threat to your survival, you take your power back. You reclaim your emotional energy. You unlock your true career and creative potential because you are no longer terrified of failure. And most importantly, you reclaim your peace of mind. You learn to interpret the world and the people in it accurately rather than constantly viewing them through a distorted, exhausting lens of primal fear.
It changes absolutely everything. You move from surviving to actually living. Thank you so much for guiding us through this labyrinth today. Your insights on these sources have been invaluable.
It was my absolute pleasure. This is such important work.
To our listeners, we truly hope this deep dive has given you a new, compassionate framework for understanding your own mind and perhaps more grace for the emotional reactions of the people around you. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to explore on your own.
We started today's conversation by asking why one negative comment from someone else can so easily erase 10 positive ones. We spend so much time, energy, and therapy trying to build boundary bubbles to defend ourselves against the harsh words, the judgments, and the projections of other people.
But if you were to look inward tonight, and if you were to apply the pause protocol and that brilliant "is this mine" test to the thoughts echoing inside your own head, how much of your own inner dialogue, the voice that criticizes you the loudest and punishes you the most, would you suddenly realize actually belongs to someone else?